Stranded, a millionaire knocked on a poor woman's door. Her request shocked him. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Robert Johnson had built walls around his heart higher than the skyscrapers he now commanded from his corner office. The world-renowned surgeon-turned-ruthless CEO had traded his scalpel for spreadsheets, his calling for cold calculation. But when a storm traps him at the humble home of Sarah Miller, a single mother fighting to save her dying son, those walls begin to crack. Sarah doesn't want his money. She wants something far more dangerous. A miracle. A prayer. A heart for her child. What she doesn't know is that the man standing in her doorway once held healing in his hands until tragedy made him swear never to operate again. Now, as her son's life hangs in the balance, Robert must choose between the safety of his isolation and the terrifying possibility of love, redemption, and second chances. The storm came without warning, as most devastating things do. Robert Johnson pressed harder on the accelerator, his black luxury sedan cutting through sheets of rain that hammered the windshield with increasing fury. The GPS had lost signal 20 miles back, leaving him to navigate the winding mountain roads by instinct and the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the treacherous curves ahead. He should have stayed in Denver another night, should have waited for clearer weather before making the drive back to Seattle. But Robert had learned long ago that staying still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering things he had spent the last 3 years trying to forget. Thunder exploded overhead, so close it seemed to shake the earth itself. The rain intensified, turning the asphalt into a river of uncertainty. Robert's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel as he squinted through the deluge, searching for any sign of civilization in this godforsaken stretch of wilderness. At 47, Robert Johnson was a man accustomed to control. As CEO of MedTech Innovations, he commanded respect from boardrooms to operating rooms, though he hadn't set foot in the latter for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting. Another lightning strike revealed what looked like a driveway ahead, barely visible through the curtain of rain. Robert didn't hesitate. He turned the wheel sharply, his sedan skidding slightly on the slick pavement before finding purchase on the gravel path that led toward a modest house nestled among towering pines. The house was small, perhaps 800 square feet, with white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch that looked like it had seen better decades. Warm light glowed through the windows, promising sanctuary from the storm that raged with no sign of abating. Robert killed the engine and sat for a moment, watching the rain cascade down his windshield in rivers. He had built an empire on precision, on calculated risks and measured outcomes. Nothing about this moment fit into any of those categories. Everything about seeking shelter from strangers went against his carefully constructed isolation. But the alternative was potentially wrapping his car around one of the massive trees that lined this mountain road. Robert grabbed his leather briefcase and sprinted toward the porch, his expensive suit jacket providing little protection against the driving rain. He reached the front door soaked and breathless, water dripping from his dark hair onto the weathered wooden planks beneath his feet. The door opened before he could knock. A woman stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light spilling from inside. She was perhaps 42, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and wearing faded jeans and a soft yellow sweater that had seen many washings. Her green eyes held a mixture of surprise and concern as she took in his bedraggled appearance. "Oh my goodness," she said, stepping back immediately. "Please, come in before you catch pneumonia." Robert hesitated for just a moment. 3 years of self-imposed isolation had made him wary of human kindness, especially the genuine variety that seemed to radiate from this stranger. But another crash of thunder made the decision for him. "Thank you," he said, stepping across the threshold into warmth and light. "I'm sorry to impose my car, the storm." "Do not apologize," the woman said, closing the door firmly against the wind. "I am Sarah Miller, and you are welcome here." She gestured toward his dripping clothes. "Let me get you a towel and something warm to drink. Coffee or tea?" Robert found himself studying her face, searching for the angle, the calculation that always lurked behind offers of help in his world. He found none. Sarah Miller's concern appeared as genuine as the storm raging outside. "Coffee would be appreciated," he said carefully. "I am Robert Johnson. I will compensate you, of course, for the inconvenience." Something flickered across Sarah's expression, not offense exactly, but a gentle sadness that Robert couldn't quite interpret. "Mr. Johnson, you are not an inconvenience," she said simply. "You are a person caught in a storm who needs shelter. That is what neighbors do for each other, even when they have never met." She disappeared down a short hallway, returning moments later with a thick blue towel and a questioning look. "Are you injured? You look a bit pale." Robert accepted the towel, acutely aware that he was dripping expensive rainwater onto her modest hardwood floors. "I am fine. Just cold and wet." "The coffee will be ready in a few minutes," Sarah said, moving toward what appeared to be a compact but efficient kitchen. "Please, make yourself comfortable." Robert looked around the living room, taking in details with the analytical eye that had served him well in both medicine and business. The furniture was simple, but well-maintained, with colorful throws draped over a faded couch and mismatched chairs that somehow worked together. Books filled a corner bookshelf, their spines showing the wear of frequent reading. Children's drawings were carefully displayed on the refrigerator, visible through the kitchen doorway. A child lived here. The realization hit him with unexpected force, bringing with it a flood of memories he had spent 3 years trying to suppress. The sound of small feet running down hospital corridors, tiny hands reaching for his larger ones, eyes full of trust that he had ultimately betrayed. "Mama, who is the man?" Robert turned to see a boy standing in the hallway, wearing Spider-Man pajamas and rubbing sleep from his eyes. The child was small for what Robert estimated to be 6 or 7 years old, with sandy brown hair that stuck up at odd angles and his mother's green eyes. But it was the pallor of his skin and the slight bluish tint around his lips that made Robert's breath catch in his throat. The signs were unmistakable to someone who had spent 15 years as a pediatric heart surgeon. "Leo, this is Mr. Johnson," Sarah said, moving quickly to her son's side. "He got caught in the storm and needs a warm place to stay tonight." Leo studied Robert with the unguarded curiosity of childhood. "Are you okay, Mr. Johnson? You look sad." Out of the mouths of babes, Robert managed what he hoped passed for a reassuring smile. "I am fine, Leo. Just wet from the rain. Mama makes the best hot chocolate," Leo said, apparently deciding that Robert posed no threat. "She puts little marshmallows in it." "That sounds wonderful," Robert replied, surprised by the genuine warmth in his own voice. He had avoided children since leaving medicine, finding their innocence too painful to bear. Yet something about Leo's gentle spirit made conversation feel natural rather than torturous. Sarah guided Leo back toward what Robert assumed was his bedroom. "You need your rest, sweetheart. The rain will probably keep us all awake enough as it is." "Can Mr. Johnson tell me about his car?" Leo asked, looking back at Robert with hopeful eyes. "I saw the headlights. It looks really fancy." "Perhaps in the morning," Robert said carefully. "If the storm passes by then." After Sarah tucked Leo back into bed, she returned to the kitchen and poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. She handed one to Robert, noting how his hands shook slightly as he accepted it. "Leo has always been curious about everything," she said, settling into the chair across from him. Sometimes I think he would talk to a tree if it would talk back. He seems like a remarkable child, Robert said, meaning it more than he expected to. How old is he? 7 last month, Sarah replied, and Robert caught the shadow that crossed her face. He is my miracle baby. The doctors said I would never have children after my accident, but Leo proved them wrong. Robert nodded, filing away the information while trying not to notice how Sarah's fingers worried the handle of her coffee mug. In his experience, parents only wore that particular expression when their children faced challenges beyond the ordinary. The storm continued its assault on the small house, rattling windows and sending wind howling around the eaves. But inside, wrapped in unexpected warmth and the gentle presence of strangers who had become temporary sanctuary, Robert found himself feeling something he had almost forgotten existed: peace. The coffee was stronger than Robert expected, with a richness that spoke of careful selection despite what appeared to be modest circumstances. He sipped it slowly, studying Sarah Miller over the rim of his mug while she moved around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency. She was beautiful in an understated way that caught him off guard. Not the polished, calculated beauty of the women who frequented the corporate events he was obligated to attend, but something more fundamental. Her movements held grace born of purpose rather than performance, and when she smiled, which she did often while talking about Leo, her entire face transformed. "I should call someone," she said suddenly, pausing in her tidying. "Let them know you are safe. Your wife, perhaps." "There is no wife," Robert replied, the words coming out more clipped than he intended. "No one is expecting me." Sarah's expression softened with what might have been sympathy, but she didn't press. Instead, she gestured toward the storm still raging outside. "Well, you are certainly not going anywhere tonight. The guest room is not much, but the bed is comfortable and the sheets are clean." Robert set down his coffee mug with careful precision. What would be appropriate compensation for the room? The question seemed to startle her. Sarah blinked, then gave a small laugh that held no humor. "Mr. Johnson, I am not running a bed and breakfast. You are a person who needs help. I'm a person who can provide it. That is the end of the transaction." "Everyone expects payment for services rendered," Robert said, his tone carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of cynicism. "In my experience, kindness always comes with a price tag attached." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, and Robert felt exposed under her steady gaze. When she spoke, her voice held gentle firmness. "I am sorry that has been your experience," she said, "but that is not how things work in this house. You are welcome here, no strings attached, no payment required." Robert found himself genuinely confused by her response. In his world, every interaction was a negotiation, every favor carried an implied debt. The concept of unconditional assistance existed only in theories and children's stories. "I do not understand," he admitted. "What do you not understand? Why you would help a complete stranger without expecting anything in return?" Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter, her expression thoughtful. "Because someone helped me once, when I needed it most. A kind stranger who asked for nothing but the chance to do good in the world." "And what did you learn from that experience?" "That kindness is not a business transaction," Sarah said simply. "It is a choice we make to honor the best parts of ourselves and each other." Thunder crashed overhead, making them both flinch. The lights flickered briefly before stabilizing, and Sarah moved to check the windows against the driving rain. "This storm is worse than I expected," she murmured, more to herself than to Robert. "I hope the power holds." "Do you get storms like this often?" "Not usually this intense," Sarah replied, returning to her chair. "We moved here about 2 years ago for the clean air and quiet. It has been good for Leo." There it was again, that shadow crossing her face when she mentioned her son. Robert recognized the expression from countless consultations with worried parents. It was the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy to share with strangers, yet too overwhelming to bear alone. "The clean air is important for his health?" Robert asked carefully. Sarah hesitated, her fingers finding that coffee mug handle again. "Leo has some respiratory challenges. The doctors thought the mountain air might help." It was a partial truth, Robert realized. The careful phrasing, the way she avoided eye contact, the protective instinct that seemed to surround any discussion of her son, all pointed to something more serious than simple respiratory issues. But he was no longer in the business of diagnosing children's medical problems. That part of his life had ended on an operating table in Boston with a 9-year-old girl who had trusted him to save her life. "I should let you get some rest," Robert said, standing abruptly. "You have been more than generous with your time and hospitality." "Of course," Sarah said, rising as well. "Let me show you to the guest room." She led him down the short hallway, past what appeared to be her bedroom and Leo's room, where soft light still glowed under the door. The guest room was indeed small, barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser, but it was spotlessly clean and smelled faintly of lavender. "There are extra blankets in the closet if you get cold," Sarah said, switching on a bedside lamp. "The bathroom is just across the hall. Please make yourself at home." "Thank you," Robert said, meaning it more than he had meant any words in a very long time. Sarah paused in the doorway, her expression unreadable in the soft light. "Mr. Johnson, can I ask what you do for work?" Robert felt his walls slam back into place with almost audible force. "I run a medical technology company." "Are you a doctor?" The question hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, he could not breathe, could not think, could not do anything but remember the weight of tiny hands going still beneath his own. "I was," he said finally. "A long time ago." Sarah nodded, as if she understood something he had not said. "Good night, Mr. Johnson. I hope you sleep well." After she left, Robert sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at the rain streaming down the single window. The storm showed no signs of abating, and he found himself oddly grateful for the forced delay in his journey. When had he last been in a home like this? A place where people lived rather than simply existed between obligations. Where children drew pictures that got displayed with pride. Where coffee was made with care rather than convenience. Where strangers were welcomed without calculation. He could not remember. Robert removed his damp shirt and hung it over the chair to dry, then lay down on the bed still wearing his dress pants. The sheets smelled like sunshine and detergent, and he realized Sarah had probably washed them herself rather than sending them to a service. From Leo's room came the soft sound of coughing, wet, labored coughs that made Robert's medical instincts surge to life, despite his best efforts to suppress them. Those were not the coughs of simple respiratory challenges. Those were the coughs of a child whose heart was working too hard to pump blood through lungs that were not receiving adequate circulation. Robert closed his eyes and tried to block out the sound, but years of training made it impossible. Every cough was a diagnostic clue, every labored breath a piece of a puzzle he no longer wanted to solve. But as he lay there, listening to the storm rage outside and a sick child struggle to breathe in the room next door, Robert Johnson began to suspect that some puzzles choose their own solvers, regardless of whether those solvers consider themselves ready for the challenge. Robert woke to the sound of whispered voices and the pale grey light of dawn filtering through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, disorientation held him suspended between sleep and wakefulness until the events of the previous evening came flooding back. The storm, Sarah Miller, Leo, the coughing. He sat up, listening intently. The voices were coming from the kitchen, Sarah's gentle murmur punctuated by Leo's higher tones, though the boy's words were interrupted frequently by the same wet, labored coughs that had kept Robert awake for much of the night. Robert checked his watch, 6:15 in the morning. Through the guest room window, he could see that the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling with residual raindrops. Tree branches littered the driveway, and he could see that his sedan had acquired a coating of mud and debris, but it appeared undamaged. He could leave now, should leave now. Return to his carefully ordered life in Seattle, where children's coughs did not pierce the walls he had built around his conscience. Instead, he found himself dressing quickly and following the sound of voices toward the kitchen. "Good morning," Sarah said as he appeared in the doorway. She was standing at the stove, wearing the same jeans as the night before, but with a different sweater, this one a soft blue that complemented her eyes. "I hope we did not wake you." "Not at all," Robert replied, though they both knew it was a polite lie. He looked toward Leo, who was sitting at the small kitchen table with a bowl of cereal in front of him and dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. "Mr. Johnson," Leo said, his face brightening despite his obvious fatigue. "You stayed. Mama said you might have to leave early. The storm made quite a mess of the roads," Robert said, accepting the cup of coffee Sarah offered him. "I thought it best to wait for full daylight before attempting to navigate the debris." It was another polite lie, and from the knowing look in Sarah's eyes, she recognized it as such. Leo launched into an animated description of the storm, his words punctuated by coughs that made Robert wince internally. The boy had clearly been awake much of the night, and his breathing seemed more labored than it had been the evening before. "Leo, finish your breakfast," Sarah said gently, placing a hand on her son's forehead in a gesture that appeared casual, but which Robert recognized as a mother's subtle temperature check. "I'm not very hungry," Leo said, pushing the cereal around his bowl with little enthusiasm. "Just a few more bites," Sarah coaxed. "You need your strength." Robert watched the interaction with the clinical eye he could not seem to turn off. Leo's lack of appetite, combined with the coughing and his pale complexion, painted a picture that became clearer with each observation. The child was not simply dealing with respiratory challenges, he was in the early stages of congestive heart failure. "Perhaps Leo would like to see my car," Robert heard himself saying. "If that is acceptable to you, Miss Miller." Sarah's face showed surprise at the offer, but Leo's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "Really? Can I, Mama? Please." "If Mr. Johnson does not mind," Sarah said carefully, "and if you promise to stay close and do exactly as you are told." "I promise," Leo said, abandoning his cereal entirely and sliding down from his chair with an energy that seemed to exhaust him. Robert led Leo outside, noting how the boy had to stop twice to catch his breath during the short walk to the car. The morning air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and the fresh smell of rain-washed earth. "Wow," Leo breathed, running his small hand along the sedan's sleek lines. "It is so shiny. What kind of car is it?" "It is a luxury sedan," Robert replied, unable to suppress a smile at the boy's obvious awe. "Would you like to sit inside?" Leo's eyes went wide. "Could I?" Robert opened the driver's door and helped Leo climb into the seat, adjusting it so the boy could reach the steering wheel. Leo's hands gripped the leather-wrapped wheel with reverence, his imagination clearly supplying engine sounds and racing scenarios. "Where would you drive if you could go anywhere?" Robert asked. Leo considered this with the seriousness of childhood. "I would drive to the ocean," he said finally. "Mama promised we would go someday, when I'm feeling better. Have you ever seen the ocean?" "No, but I have seen pictures. It looks really big. Bigger than anything." Leo turned to look at Robert with those serious green eyes. "Have you seen the ocean?" "Many times," Robert replied. "It is indeed bigger than anything you can imagine." "What does it sound like?" "Like breathing," Robert said, surprising himself with the poetic response. "Like the world breathing in and out, over and over." Leo smiled at this description, and for a moment his face held the pure joy that should be every child's birthright. Then another coughing fit seized him, harsh and wet, and Robert found himself automatically reaching out to steady the boy's small frame. The cough seemed to go on forever, and when it finally subsided, Leo's lips had taken on a more pronounced, bluish tint. Robert felt his medical training surge to the forefront of his consciousness, cataloguing symptoms and running through differential diagnoses despite his determination to remain uninvolved. "Are you all right?" Robert asked, though he already knew the answer. Leo nodded, but his breathing was clearly labored. "Sometimes I get tired really easy," he said, as if apologizing for his body's limitations. "We should get you back inside," Robert said gently. "Your mother will worry." They made their way back to the house slowly, Leo stopping twice to rest. Sarah met them at the door, her face tight with concern as she took in her son's condition. "I think someone needs to lie down for a while," she said, scooping Leo into her arms with practiced ease. "But I wanted to ask Mr. Johnson more questions," Leo protested weakly. "Perhaps after you rest," Robert said. "It will be here for a while longer." Sarah carried Leo toward his bedroom, and Robert heard her murmuring soft reassurances as they disappeared down the hallway. He stood in the living room, staring out the window at the storm-damaged landscape, and tried to convince himself that whatever was wrong with Leo Miller was not his responsibility. The attempt failed miserably. When Sarah returned, her composure was carefully maintained, but Robert could see the fear she was trying to hide. "He overdid it," she said, more to herself than to him. "I should have known better than to let him get so excited." "Miss Miller," Robert began, then stopped. He had no right to ask the questions that were burning in his throat, no standing to offer observations that would only confirm what she probably already knew. "Sarah," she corrected absently, moving to clear Leo's abandoned breakfast from the table. "Sarah," Robert repeated, testing the name. It fit her, simple, strong, beautiful in its straightforwardness. "How long has Leo been ill?" Sarah's hand stilled on the cereal bowl. For a moment, Robert thought she would deflect the question as she had the night before. Then her shoulders sagged slightly, as if the burden of carrying her secret alone had finally become too much. "Since he was born," she said quietly, "but it has gotten worse this past year." Robert waited, sensing that she needed to tell someone, anyone, about the weight she had been carrying. "He has a congenital heart defect," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hypoplastic left heart syndrome, they call it. He has had 2 surgeries already, but—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Robert felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Hypoplastic left heart syndrome, one of the most complex congenital heart defects, requiring a series of staged surgeries to reconstruct the heart's function. He had performed dozens of these procedures during his career, had seen the fear in parents' eyes, had held their hopes in his hands, had failed catastrophically on his last attempt. "The doctors say he needs a transplant," Sarah whispered, the words seeming to tear themselves from her throat. "We are on the list, but—" She shrugged helplessly. "But time is running out," Robert finished for her. Sarah nodded, tears finally spilling over despite her efforts to contain them. "I moved us here thinking the clean air would help, thinking I could give him a better quality of life while we wait. But he is getting weaker, and I do not know what else to do." Robert stood frozen, caught between the overwhelming urge to flee and the equally powerful need to help. This was exactly the situation he had spent 3 years avoiding. A sick child, a desperate parent, the terrible weight of expectations he was no longer sure he could meet. "Have you gotten a second opinion?" he asked, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. 3 opinions, Sarah replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. They all say the same thing. Without a transplant, Leo has maybe 6 months. 6 months. Robert closed his eyes, remembering another child, another desperate timeline, another parent who had trusted him with everything that mattered. "I am sorry," he said inadequately. "That must be terrifying," Sarah finished. "It is terrifying, but I cannot let Leo see that because he needs me to be strong. He needs me to believe that everything will be all right. And do you believe that everything will be all right?" Sarah met his eyes, and in them Robert saw a fierce determination that took his breath away. "I have to," she said simply, "because the alternative is unacceptable." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Robert found himself caught in the grip of emotions he had spent 3 years learning to suppress, the familiar mix of professional determination and personal terror that had once defined his every waking moment. Sarah moved to the window, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could physically hold her fears at bay. Outside, the morning sun was burning away the last traces of the storm, painting the world in shades of gold and green that seemed to mock the darkness of their conversation. "I should not have told you all that," Sarah said finally. "You came here seeking shelter from a storm, not to be burdened with a stranger's problems." "You did not burden me," Robert replied, though they both knew that was not entirely true. Knowledge was always a burden, especially knowledge that demanded action, and we are not strangers anymore. Sarah turned to look at him, and Robert saw something shift in her expression, a recognition that this conversation had changed something fundamental between them. "What kind of doctor were you?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke, acrid and inescapable. Robert felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble under the weight of Sarah's need, and Leo's innocence, and his own guilty conscience. "Pediatric cardiac surgery," he said, the words feeling rusty from disuse. Sarah's intake of breath was sharp enough to cut glass. "You operated on children's hearts?" "For 15 years, Robert confirmed, hating the hope that was beginning to dawn in her eyes. "Until I stopped." "Why did you stop?" Robert closed his eyes, and immediately he was back in that operating room in Boston, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a surgical team fighting to save a life. He could smell the antiseptic, hear the steady beep of monitors, feel the weight of tiny ribs beneath his hands as he tried desperately to repair what nature had built imperfectly. "Because I failed," he said simply. "A 9-year-old girl named Emma Castellano. Same condition as Leo. I thought I could save her. What happened?" "I made a mistake," Robert said, the words tasting like ashes. "A miscalculation during the procedure. She died on the table." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When she spoke, her voice held compassion rather than judgment. That must have been devastating. "It was the end of everything I thought I was," Robert replied. "I had built my entire identity around being the surgeon who could fix the unfixable, who could give desperate parents their miracles. When Emma died, I realized I was just another human being with limitations and flaws, and the capacity to make fatal errors." "So you stopped operating?" "I stopped everything," Robert corrected. "I left medicine entirely, took over the business side of medical technology. I told myself I could help more children by developing better equipment than I ever could, by wielding a scalpel." "And has that been true?" Robert laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The company has been very successful. We have developed several innovations that have improved surgical outcomes worldwide. But has it felt like helping children?" He shook his head. "It has felt like hiding." Sarah moved closer, and Robert caught the faint scent of her shampoo, something floral and uncomplicated that reminded him of simpler times. "Perhaps hiding was what you needed then," she said gently, "but that does not mean it is what you need now." "Sarah," Robert began, recognizing the dangerous territory their conversation was entering. "Leo's scans are in his medical file," Sarah said quietly. "Would you look at them? I cannot—" "Not as his doctor," Sarah interrupted, "as someone who understands what we are facing, as someone who could help me ask the right questions when we meet with the transplant team next week." Robert felt the walls of his carefully constructed isolation pressing in around him. For 3 years, he had successfully avoided any situation that might require him to think like a surgeon, to feel the weight of medical responsibility, to risk another catastrophic failure. But Leo's labored breathing from the next room was a constant reminder that some responsibilities chose their own bearers, regardless of personal preference. "The scans would not tell me anything you do not already know," Robert said carefully. "Leo needs a heart transplant. The surgery is complex, but manageable for an experienced team. The challenge is finding a suitable donor." "But what if they find one?" Sarah pressed. "What if a heart becomes available tomorrow? Are there things I should know about the surgery itself? Risks I should be prepared for, questions I should ask the surgical team?" Robert rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar tension headache that had plagued him during his years of practice. The questions were reasonable, the request almost mundane. A former surgeon reviewing case files to help a worried parent understand their options. It happened every day in hospitals across the country. So why did it feel like stepping back onto a precipice he had barely survived falling from once before? "I will look at the scans," Robert heard himself saying, "but only to help you understand what you are facing. Nothing more." The relief in Sarah's eyes was so profound it made Robert's chest ache. She disappeared down the hallway and returned moments later with a thick manila folder that looked well worn from handling. "These are copies of everything," she said, placing the folder on the kitchen table with reverent care. "His birth records, surgical reports, recent imaging studies, cardiology consultations." Robert stared at the folder as if it might contain explosives rather than medical records. In many ways, it represented something far more dangerous. The possibility of caring again, of allowing himself to become invested in an outcome he might not be able to control. "I need coffee," he said finally. "A lot of coffee." Sarah smiled for the first time since their conversation had taken its serious turn. "I can provide that." As she busied herself with making fresh coffee, Robert opened the folder with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. The first document was Leo's birth certificate, followed by the initial diagnostic workup that would have been performed when his condition was first identified. The familiar rhythm of medical interpretation began to take hold, pushing aside 3 years of deliberate ignorance. Robert found himself cataloging information, cross-referencing findings, building a complete picture of Leo's medical journey from birth to present. It was worse than he had expected. Leo had undergone his first surgery, a Norwood procedure, at 6 days old, followed by a Glenn shunt at 4 months. Both surgeries had been performed competently, but the imaging studies from the past year showed progressive deterioration in cardiac function that indicated the final stage of surgical intervention would not be sufficient. Leo Miller was not just a candidate for heart transplantation. Without it, he would not survive another 6 months, possibly less. Robert set down the final scan and looked up to find Sarah watching him with barely contained anxiety. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. Robert had delivered difficult news to countless families during his career, but somehow this felt different, more personal, more devastating. "It is complicated," he said carefully. "That is what all the doctors say," Sarah replied with a bitter laugh. "I need someone to be honest with me, Robert. I need to know what we are really facing." Robert met her eyes and saw not just a mother's desperation, but a woman's strength. Sarah Miller could handle the truth, however difficult it might be. "Leo's heart is failing faster than the doctors initially projected," Robert said gently. "The timeline for transplantation has accelerated significantly. Without a suitable donor in the next few months, his condition will become critical." Sarah nodded, absorbing this confirmation of her worst fears with remarkable composure. "And if they find a donor, the surgery itself is complex but routine for a good transplant team. The real challenges come afterward: rejection, infection, the lifelong need for immunosuppressive medications. But Leo would have a chance at a normal childhood." "What are his odds with transplantation?" Robert hesitated, knowing that statistics could be both comfort and curse to worried parents. "With a good surgical team and an appropriate donor, perhaps 70 to 80% survival rate for the first year. If he makes it through the initial recovery period, his long-term prognosis improves significantly." "And without transplantation?" "Sarah, I need to know." Robert looked at this brave woman who was asking him to quantify her worst nightmares and felt something shift inside his chest. Something that felt dangerously like the compassion that had once driven him to spend 18-hour days in operating rooms, fighting to save lives that others had given up on. "Without transplantation, Leo has perhaps 3 to 4 months before his condition becomes unsurvivable," Robert said quietly. Sarah closed her eyes, and Robert watched her absorb this timeline with the same quiet strength she seemed to bring to everything in her life. "Thank you," she said finally, "for being honest, for helping me understand." "I wish I could do more," Robert said, meaning it more than he had meant anything in years. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression he could not quite interpret. "Perhaps you can," she said softly. The words hung between them like a question that neither was quite ready to ask or answer. Robert felt his pulse quicken, recognizing the dangerous territory they were approaching. In Sarah's eyes, he could see the beginning of hope, the terrible, beautiful hope that parents carried when they believed someone might be able to save their child. It was the same hope he had seen in Emma Castellano's mother's eyes, right up until the moment he had to tell her that her daughter was gone. "Sarah," Robert began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I am not asking you to be Leo's surgeon," she said quietly. "I would never put that kind of pressure on anyone, especially someone who has already paid such a high price for trying to help children." Robert felt something inside him relax slightly, even as another part of him, a part he had thought permanently silenced, whispered that maybe he should be Leo's surgeon. "But," Sarah continued, "you understand this condition in a way that I never could. You know the right questions to ask, the warning signs to watch for, the subtle differences between surgical teams that could make the difference between success and failure. What are you asking?" Sarah moved to the window again, gazing out at the world that had been washed clean by the storm. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that had clearly been building for some time. "Come with us to the consultation next week," she said. "Help me understand what the doctors are really saying. Help me make sure Leo gets the best possible care." The request was reasonable, Robert told himself. Consulting on a case, providing guidance to worried parents, helping ensure that a child received optimal medical care, these were all things he could do without stepping back into the operating room that had become his personal hell. But even as he tried to rationalize the decision, Robert knew that getting more involved in Leo's case meant getting more involved in Leo's life, and in Sarah's life. And that was territory he had been avoiding for 3 years for very good reasons. "I would need to review the current status of the transplant list," Robert heard himself saying. Understand the selection criteria, the waiting times, the protocols at the transplant center. Does that mean yes? Robert looked at Sarah's face and saw not just hope now, but gratitude and relief, and something else that made his chest tighten with emotions he had almost forgotten how to feel. It means I will help in whatever way I can, he said carefully, without making promises I might not be able to keep. Sarah's smile was brilliant enough to power the small house. Thank you, she whispered. You cannot know what this means to me. But Robert suspected he could know because he was beginning to feel the dangerous stirrings of caring again, caring about outcomes he could not control, investing in lives that were not his responsibility, allowing himself to hope for miracles he was not sure he could deliver. From Leo's room came the sound of movement, followed by the boy's voice calling for his mother. Sarah hurried down the hallway, and Robert could hear her gentle murmur as she checked on her son, followed by Leo's higher tones, asking if Mr. Johnson was still there. Robert looked at the medical files spread across the kitchen table and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. For 3 years, he had successfully avoided this feeling, the sense that lives hung in the balance of decisions he might make, skills he might employ, wisdom he might offer. Now, staring at Leo Miller's cardiac imaging studies, Robert realized that some responsibilities were impossible to escape. Some children chose their own champions, regardless of whether those champions felt ready for the role. Sarah returned from Leo's room with a slight smile. He wants to know if you will still be here when he wakes up from his nap. What did you tell him? That I hoped so, Sarah replied. Was that the right answer? Robert considered the question, weighing his desire to flee against the growing certainty that fleeing would mean abandoning people who had already suffered enough abandonment. I should call my office, he said finally. Let them know I will be delayed getting back to Seattle. How delayed? Robert looked at Sarah Miller, this woman who had opened her home to a stranger, who was fighting to save her son's life with nothing but determination and love, who had somehow managed to crack through walls he had thought were impenetrable, and felt something shift inside him that he could not name. I am not sure, he said honestly. How long until the consultation? 5 days. Then at least 5 days, Robert replied, possibly longer. Sarah's relief was so profound it was almost tangible. She moved toward him, and for a moment Robert thought she might embrace him. Instead, she reached out and gently touched his hand where it rested on the table. I know this is difficult for you, she said softly. I can see that it is. But Robert, you being here, you helping us understand what we are facing, it feels like the first real hope I have had in months. Robert looked down at her hand covering his and felt the warmth of human connection that he had denied himself for 3 years. Sarah's touch was light, tentative, but it carried the weight of trust and gratitude and something that might have been the beginning of deeper feelings. I cannot promise miracles, he said quietly. I am not asking for miracles, Sarah replied. I am asking for your knowledge, your experience, your wisdom. I am asking you to help me be the best advocate possible for my son. And if the outcome is not what we hope for, Sarah's fingers tightened slightly on his hand, then at least we will know we did everything possible. At least Leo will know he was surrounded by people who cared about him, who fought for him. Robert turned his hand palm up, allowing their fingers to intertwine in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. He could not remember the last time he had allowed himself this kind of physical connection, this acknowledgement of shared purpose and mutual support. All right, he said, the words carrying the weight of commitment he had not made in years. I will stay. I will help. We will figure this out together. Sarah's smile was radiant, and Robert felt something he had thought was permanently dead begin to stir back to life in his chest. It might have been hope. It might have been purpose. It might have been the dangerous possibility of caring about someone other than himself. Whatever it was, Robert found himself welcoming it, even as part of him recognized that welcoming hope meant accepting the possibility of loss, and accepting the possibility of caring meant accepting the possibility of having his heart broken all over again. But looking at Sarah Miller's grateful smile and thinking about Leo's bright spirit struggling against a failing heart, Robert realized that some risks were worth taking, regardless of the potential cost. The storm outside had passed, but inside the small house, a different kind of storm was just beginning, the kind that changed everything and left nothing unchanged in its wake. The next 3 hours passed in a strange suspension of normal time. Robert found himself settling into the rhythm of Sarah's household in ways that surprised him, helping clear breakfast dishes, listening to Leo's animated chatter when the boy woke from his nap, even attempting to answer questions about cars and cities, and whether it was true that some buildings were taller than mountains. Leo's curiosity was boundless, his spirit undaunted by the physical limitations that left him breathless after climbing onto the couch. Robert watched the boy navigate his world with determination and grace, never complaining about the fatigue that was clearly his constant companion. "Mr. Johnson," Leo said, settling beside Robert on the faded sofa with a stack of picture books. "Do you have any kids?" The question hit Robert like a physical blow. For a moment, he could not breathe, could not think past the sudden surge of memories, not of his own children, which he had never had, but of all the children he had tried to save, all the small faces that had looked up at him with trust he had ultimately betrayed. "No," Robert managed finally. "I do not have children." "How come?" Leo asked with the guileless curiosity of childhood. Robert glanced toward the kitchen, where Sarah was preparing lunch, and caught her watching him with understanding in her eyes. She had clearly heard the exchange and recognized his struggle with the question. "I suppose I was too busy with work to think about having a family," Robert said carefully. Leo considered this with the seriousness he seemed to bring to all important matters. "That sounds lonely." "It can be," Robert admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "Well, you are not lonely now," Leo declared, with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old. "You are here with us." The simple statement carried more weight than Leo could possibly understand. Robert felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he had almost forgotten how to recognize. When had he last felt included in anything that mattered? When had he last been welcomed, not for what he could provide or accomplish, but simply for who he was? "You are right," Robert said softly. "I am here with you." Leo smiled and opened one of his books, a colorful story about a bear who learned to fly. As he began to read aloud, his small finger tracking the words across the page, Robert found himself drawn into the simple magic of a child's imagination. But underneath the warmth of the moment, Robert could not ignore the medical reality that shaped every breath Leo took. The boy's color was still too pale, his breathing still too labored, his energy still too limited. Even as Leo read about impossible adventures and fantastic journeys, Robert was calculating timelines and considering options with the analytical mind that had once made him one of the most sought-after pediatric surgeons in the country. "Lunch is ready," Sarah called from the kitchen, breaking the spell of story time. As they gathered around the small table, Robert noted how Sarah had prepared Leo's sandwich in tiny pieces, making it easier for the boy to eat without becoming winded. She served Robert a bowl of homemade soup that tasted like comfort itself, rich with vegetables and herbs that spoke of careful preparation and genuine care. "This is excellent," Robert said, meaning it completely. "It is Leo's favorite," Sarah replied, smiling as her son managed several spoonfuls despite his obvious fatigue. "My grandmother's recipe. She always said good soup could cure anything." What could it cure for you? Leo asked Robert seriously. Robert paused, spoon halfway to his mouth, caught off guard by the depth of the question. What did he need curing from? 3 years of isolation, the weight of professional failure, the emptiness of a life built around avoiding rather than embracing meaningful connections. I think it might cure loneliness, Robert said finally, echoing Leo's earlier observation. Sarah's eyes met his across the table, and Robert saw understanding there that went deeper than words. She knew about loneliness, he realized. Despite having Leo, despite the warmth that filled her small house, Sarah Miller understood what it meant to carry burdens alone. After lunch, Leo grew visibly tired, his eyelids heavy despite his efforts to stay awake. Sarah carried him to his room for another nap, and Robert could hear her singing softly as she tucked him in, a gentle lullaby that spoke of love and safety and the fierce protection only a mother could provide. When Sarah returned to the living room, Robert was standing at the window, staring out at the mountain landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. "It is beautiful here," he said as she joined him. "Peaceful," Sarah agreed. "Leo loves watching the sunrise from his bedroom window. He says it looks like the whole world is made of gold." "How do you do it?" Robert asked quietly. "How do you stay so strong for him when you must be terrified inside?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Because falling apart is not an option," she said simply. "Leo needs me to believe that everything will be all right, so I choose to believe it every single day, even when the believing feels impossible. That takes incredible courage." "It takes incredible love," Sarah corrected. "Courage is facing something you are afraid of. Love is facing something you cannot bear to lose." Robert turned to look at her, struck by the simple profundity of her words. In the afternoon light streaming through the window, Sarah's face held a beauty that went far beyond the physical. It was the beauty of absolute devotion, of strength forged in the fires of necessity, of hope maintained in the face of overwhelming odds. "I used to think I understood love," Robert said quietly. "I thought it was the feeling I had for my work, for the challenge of saving lives, for the satisfaction of performing miracles. But watching you with Leo, I'm beginning to realize I may not have understood it at all." Sarah moved closer, and Robert caught again that faint scent of her shampoo, mixed now with the lingering aroma of herbs from lunch preparation. "What do you think love is now?" she asked softly. Robert considered the question, thinking about the past 24 hours, about the way Sarah had opened her door to a stranger, about the fierce protectiveness in her eyes when she looked at Leo, about the trust she had placed in him despite knowing him for less than a day. "I think love is choosing someone else's well-being over your own comfort," he said finally. "I think it is staying when staying is hard, fighting when fighting seems hopeless, believing when believing requires everything you have." "That sounds like the kind of love that changes everything," Sarah said. "It does," Robert replied, and realized he was no longer talking only about parental love or abstract concepts. He was talking about the dangerous feelings that were beginning to take root in his own chest, feelings for this remarkable woman who had somehow managed to crack through every defense he had built around his heart. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting the modest room in shades of gold that reminded Robert of Leo's description of sunrise. In this light, with Sarah standing close enough to touch, with the sound of her son's peaceful breathing drifting from the next room, Robert felt something he had not experienced in 3 years. He felt like he was home. The afternoon stretched into evening with the kind of natural ease that surprised Robert. He had expected awkwardness, the social strain that came from spending extended time with virtual strangers. Instead, he found himself settling into the rhythm of Sarah's life as if he had always been part of it. When Leo woke from his nap, The three of them played board games at the kitchen table, simple children's games that Leo approached with the strategic intensity of a military campaign. Robert found himself laughing at the boy's elaborate explanations for his moves, genuine laughter that felt rusty from disuse. "You are cheating, Mr. Johnson," Leo declared during their third game of checkers, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "How am I cheating?" Robert asked, feigning shock. "You are letting me win," Leo said seriously. "Mama does that sometimes too, but you are both really bad at hiding it." Sarah burst into laughter from where she was preparing dinner, and Robert felt his own smile grow wider. "You are very observant, Leo. Mama says I notice everything," Leo replied proudly, "like how you keep looking at her when you think she's not watching." Robert felt heat creep up his neck as Sarah's laugh faltered slightly. The boy's innocent observation had hit uncomfortably close to the truth. Robert had been watching Sarah, captivated by the grace with which she moved through her daily routines, the gentle humor she brought to even mundane tasks, the strength that seemed to radiate from her very presence. "Leo," Sarah said gently, "perhaps Mr. Johnson would like to focus on the game." "It is all right," Robert said, meeting Leo's curious gaze. "You are correct that I have been watching your mother. She is remarkable." The simple admission hung in the air between them, more honest than Robert had intended to be. Sarah had gone very still at the stove, her back to them, but Robert could see the tension in her shoulders. "She is the best mama in the whole world," Leo said matter-of-factly, "and she makes really good cookies." "Do you like cookies, Mr. Johnson?" "I do like cookies," Robert replied, grateful for Leo's ability to navigate past awkward moments with the resilience of childhood. "Mama, can we make cookies for Mr. Johnson?" Sarah turned from the stove, her cheeks slightly flushed but her smile genuine. "After dinner, if you are feeling up to it." "I am always feeling up to cookies," Leo declared solemnly. As evening approached, Robert called his office to inform his assistant that he would be extending his absence. The conversation was brief and professional, but when he hung up, Sarah was studying him with a thoughtful expression. "Will your work suffer from you being away?" she asked. "The company will function perfectly well without me for a few days," Robert replied. "I have excellent people in place. The truth is, I am not as indispensable as I once thought I was." "That must be liberating, or terrifying," Robert said, "depending on how you look at it." They prepared dinner together, moving around the small kitchen with surprising coordination. Robert found himself assigned to chopping vegetables while Sarah seasoned chicken and Leo set the table with meticulous care. The domesticity of it felt both foreign and deeply satisfying. "How long have you lived here?" Robert asked as they worked. 2 years, Sarah replied. "We moved here from Denver after Leo's second surgery. The cardiologist thought the altitude and clean air might help with his breathing." "Has it helped?" Sarah paused in her stirring, and Robert saw that shadow cross her face again. "For a while. But his condition has progressed faster than anyone expected." "What was Denver like?" Robert asked, sensing that she needed to move away from medical discussions. "Busy," Sarah said with a small smile. "I worked as a nursing supervisor at Denver General. Long hours, demanding work, but I loved it." "You are a nurse." "Was a nurse," Sarah corrected. "When Leo got sicker, I had to choose between my career and being available for his care. It was not really a choice at all." Robert heard the note of loss in her voice and recognized it for what it was. Not regret, exactly, but grief for the life she had given up to save her son's life. "Do you miss it?" "Every day," Sarah admitted. "I miss the challenge, the sense of purpose, the feeling that I was making a difference in people's lives. But Leo needed me more than my patients did. That must have been an incredibly difficult decision," The difficult part was not the decision itself, Sarah said quietly. The difficult part was accepting that sometimes love requires us to give up the things we thought defined us. Robert set down his knife, struck by the parallel between Sarah's sacrifice and his own flight from medicine. But where Sarah had given up her career to save a life, he had given up his calling because he had failed to save one. "Do you ever think about going back?" he asked. "Sometimes," Sarah said. When this is over, one way or another, I think I would like to work with families facing similar challenges. Maybe I could help other parents navigate what we have been through." The phrase, "one way or another," hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of all the outcomes Sarah refused to speak aloud. Robert felt a surge of fierce protectiveness, a determination that there would be only one acceptable outcome for Leo Miller. "You would be extraordinary at that," Robert said softly. Their eyes met across the small kitchen, and Robert felt the air between them shift, becoming charged with something deeper than simple attraction. In Sarah's gaze, he saw not just gratitude for his support, but recognition of shared understanding, shared loss, shared hope for redemption. The moment stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, until Leo's voice broke the spell. "Is dinner ready yet? I am starving, and I really want to make those cookies." They laughed, the tension dissolving into warmth, but Robert could feel something fundamental had changed between them. The careful politeness of strangers was giving way to something more dangerous and more necessary. The kind of connection that grew between people who had seen each other's vulnerabilities and chosen to stay anyway. As they sat down to dinner, Leo chattering about cookies and card games and whether Robert thought bears could really learn to fly, Robert found himself studying Sarah's face in the soft lamplight. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was real in a way that the women in his previous life had never been. There was nothing calculated about her kindness, nothing strategic about her strength. Sarah Miller was exactly who she appeared to be, a woman who loved completely, sacrificed willingly, and hoped fiercely despite every reason to despair. And Robert was beginning to realize that he was falling for her with a completeness that terrified him. After dinner, the three of them gathered in the kitchen to make cookies, a process that turned out to be far more entertaining than Robert had anticipated. Leo insisted on measuring every ingredient himself, his small hands carefully leveling each cup of flour and sugar with the precision of a master chef. "Baking is science," Leo explained seriously as he cracked eggs into the mixing bowl. "Mama taught me that. You have to be really exact or the cookies will not turn out right." "That is very wise," Robert replied, watching as Sarah gently guided her son through the process. Her patience seemed infinite, even when Leo spilled flour across the counter or dropped eggshells into the batter. "What kind of science do you do at your work?" Leo asked Robert as they waited for the first batch to bake. Robert considered how to explain medical technology development to a 7-year-old. "I help design machines that doctors use to help sick people get better. Like the machines that beep in hospitals. Some of them, yes." Leo's face grew thoughtful. "I have seen lots of those machines. The doctors hook them up to me during my checkups." He paused, then looked directly at Robert. "Do your machines help kids like me?" The question hit Robert with unexpected force. In all his years of running medtech innovations, he had managed to maintain emotional distance from the end users of their products. They were market segments, demographic data, statistical outcomes. But looking into Leo's earnest green eyes, Robert suddenly saw the human faces behind every device his company had developed. "Yes," Robert said quietly, "some of them help children exactly like you." "That is really cool," Leo said with genuine admiration. You are like a superhero, but for real. Sarah met Robert's eyes over Leo's head, and he saw understanding there. She knew how difficult that conversation had been for him, how the boy's innocent words had forced him to confront the distance he had created between his work and its purpose. When the timer chimed, Leo insisted on removing the cookies from the oven himself, with careful supervision from both adults. The kitchen filled with the warm scent of vanilla and chocolate chips, and Robert found himself thinking that he could not remember the last time he had experienced such simple, uncomplicated happiness. "These are the best cookies in the world," Leo declared after sampling the first batch. "I think you might be right," Robert agreed, surprised by how good the homemade treats tasted compared to the expensive pastries that usually appeared at corporate functions. As Leo's energy began to flag, Sarah suggested it was time for his evening routine. Robert watched as she helped the boy with his medications, a complex regimen that spoke to the seriousness of his condition, and felt his medical training automatically cataloguing the prescriptions: digoxin for heart function, furosemide for fluid management, lisinopril for blood pressure control, the pharmaceutical arsenal of a child whose heart was losing the battle to keep him alive. "Will you read me a story?" Leo asked Robert as Sarah tucked him into bed. "If your mother does not mind," Robert replied, glancing at Sarah for permission. "I would like that very much," she said softly. Leo selected a book about a dragon who learned to be gentle, and Robert found himself drawn into the simple narrative with surprising engagement. As he read, Leo's breathing gradually deepened, his small body relaxing into sleep. "He likes you," Sarah whispered as they tiptoed out of Leo's room. "The feeling is mutual," Robert replied, meaning it completely. They settled in the living room with cups of tea, the house quiet around them except for the gentle sound of Leo's breathing from his bedroom. In the soft lamplight, with the events of the day settling between them, Robert felt the careful boundaries he had maintained beginning to dissolve. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, "for everything today, for looking at his files, for staying, for being so wonderful with Leo." "Thank you for letting me stay," Robert replied. "I cannot remember the last time I felt so what? So human," Robert finished honestly, "so connected to something that actually matters." Sarah curled her legs beneath her on the couch, tea mug cradled in her hands. "What was your life like before, in Seattle?" Robert considered the question, thinking about his sterile apartment, his regimented schedule, his carefully controlled existence that left no room for spontaneity or genuine human connection. "Efficient," he said finally, "productive, empty." "What made it empty?" "The absence of this," Robert said, gesturing around the modest room that somehow contained more warmth than his expensive penthouse. "The absence of people who matter, of moments that mean something beyond quarterly earnings or market share." "You could change that," Sarah said gently, "when you go back." The phrase, "when you go back," hit Robert with unexpected sadness. He had been here less than 48 hours, but already the thought of returning to his previous life felt like contemplating exile. "I am not sure I know how to change it," Robert admitted. "I spent 3 years learning to live without meaningful connections. I'm not sure I remember how to live with them." Sarah set down her tea and moved closer to him on the couch, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Perhaps you do not need to remember," she said softly. "Perhaps you just need to allow yourself to feel again." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and invitation. Robert found himself leaning slightly toward her, drawn by something more powerful than conscious decision. "Sarah," he said quietly, her name carrying all the longing and uncertainty he could not put into words. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." They were close enough now that Robert could count her eyelashes, could see the slight flush that had crept into her cheeks, could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. His hand moved almost of its own accord to touch her face, fingers tracing the delicate line of her cheekbone. "This is complicated," Robert said, even as he continued to lean closer. "Everything worthwhile is complicated," Sarah replied, her own hand coming up to cover his where it rested against her cheek. For a moment, they balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. Two people who had found unexpected solace in each other's company, unexpected hope in each other's presence, unexpected possibility in each other's hearts. Then Leo's voice called out from his bedroom, breaking the spell. "Mama, I had a bad dream." Sarah pulled back immediately, the moment shattered but not forgotten. "I should go to him," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "Of course," Robert replied, his hand still tingling from the warmth of her skin. As Sarah disappeared down the hallway to comfort her son, Robert remained on the couch, his heart racing with emotions he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Whatever was happening between them was moving faster than wisdom would dictate, deeper than safety would allow. But as he listened to Sarah's gentle voice soothing Leo's fears, as he sat in the warm glow of their modest home, Robert realized that some risks were worth taking, regardless of the potential consequences. He was falling for Sarah Miller, and for the first time in 3 years, he was not running away from something that mattered. Robert woke before dawn to the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. For a moment, disorientation held him. The narrow bed, the unfamiliar room, the scent of pine drifting through the window. Then memory returned, along with something that felt dangerously like contentment. He dressed quickly and made his way toward the sound of gentle activity, finding Sarah at the stove, preparing what appeared to be a more elaborate breakfast than the simple meals they had shared the previous day. "Good morning," she said softly, glancing over her shoulder with a smile that made Robert's chest tighten. "Did I wake you?" "I am usually an early riser," Robert replied, though he could not remember the last time he had slept so deeply or woken feeling so refreshed. "Can I help?" "Coffee is fresh," Sarah said, nodding toward the pot, "and Leo will be up soon asking about pancakes." "I thought I would surprise him." Robert poured himself coffee and watched Sarah work, noting the careful efficiency of her movements, the way she had clearly planned every step to maximize both nutritional value and appeal to a 7-year-old's palate. Everything she did was oriented around Leo's needs, he realized, not in a way that seemed burdensome, but with the natural grace of someone whose love had found its perfect expression. "You are staring again," Sarah said without turning around, but he could hear the smile in her voice. "I am," Robert admitted. "I find myself fascinated by how you move through the world. Everything you do seems intentional, purposeful. When you are responsible for keeping someone alive," Sarah said quietly, "intentionality becomes a survival skill." The words carried more weight than their simple surface meaning, and Robert found himself studying Sarah's profile as she stirred batter. How long had she been carrying this burden alone? How many nights had she lain awake, listening to Leo's breathing, calculating timelines, fighting hope and despair in equal measure? "How do you do it?" Robert asked. "How do you carry all of this without breaking?" Sarah paused in her stirring, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think about the alternative," she said finally. "I think about what Leo's life would look like if I fell apart, and that makes staying strong feel less like a choice and more like a necessity. But who takes care of you while you are taking care of everyone else?" The question seemed to surprise her. Sarah turned to face him fully, and Robert saw something vulnerable in her expression that she had not allowed him to see before. "I take care of myself," she said. but the words lacked conviction. "Do you?" Robert pressed gently. "When was the last time you did something purely for your own enjoyment? When did you last have a conversation about something other than Leo's medical needs? When did you last allow yourself to want something just for yourself?" Sarah's composure wavered, and Robert saw tears beginning to gather in her eyes. The questions had clearly hit close to home, forcing her to confront the reality of her own sacrifice. "I want Leo to live," she whispered. "That is all I allow myself to want." "And after?" Robert asked softly. "When Leo is better, when he has his transplant and is running around like any other child, what will you want then?" "I cannot think about after," Sarah said, tears now flowing freely. "I cannot let myself imagine a future beyond getting him through this, because what if there is no after? What if hoping for too much means I am not focused enough on right now?" Robert moved toward her without conscious decision, driven by an overwhelming need to offer comfort, to ease the burden she had been carrying alone for so long. He pulled her into his arms, and Sarah collapsed against his chest with a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "You are allowed to want things for yourself," Robert murmured against her hair. "You are allowed to hope for a future that includes your own happiness." "I am so tired," Sarah whispered into his shirt. "I am so tired of being strong all the time, of making all the decisions, of carrying all the fear by myself." "You do not have to carry it by yourself anymore," Robert said, the words carrying more commitment than he had intended to make. "I am here. For as long as you need me, I am here." They stood holding each other in the quiet kitchen as dawn light crept through the windows. Two people who had found unexpected solace in each other's arms. Robert could feel Sarah's tears soaking through his shirt, could feel her body shaking with the release of emotions she had clearly been suppressing for months. "Mama, why are you crying?" They broke apart quickly to find Leo standing in the kitchen doorway, his hair tousled from sleep and concern written across his small face. Sarah wiped her eyes hastily, but Leo was too observant to be fooled. "I am all right, sweetheart," Sarah said, moving toward her son, "just feeling a little overwhelmed this morning." Leo studied both adults with the serious expression he seemed to reserve for important matters. "Are you sad because I am sick?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Robert watched Sarah struggle to find an answer that was both honest and age-appropriate. "I am sad that you have to deal with being sick," Sarah said carefully. "But I am not sad about you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Leo seemed to accept this distinction. He moved to Robert and looked up at him with those earnest green eyes. "Are you sad too?" Leo asked. Robert knelt down to Leo's eye level, feeling the weight of the boy's trust and the importance of his answer. "I am sad that you and your mother have had to face such difficult things," Robert said honestly. "But I am not sad to be here with you. Being here with you makes me happier than I have been in a very long time." Leo nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with these explanations. "Can we still have pancakes?" "We can absolutely still have pancakes," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "In fact, I think we need extra chocolate chips this morning." As they prepared breakfast together, Robert found himself marveling at the resilience of this small family. Leo's acceptance of adult emotions, Sarah's ability to rebuild her composure for her son's sake, the way they moved around each other with practiced care. All of it spoke to strength forged in crisis, love deepened by shared struggle. But underneath the normalcy of morning routines, Robert could feel something significant had shifted between him and Sarah. The embrace in the kitchen, the vulnerability she had shown him, the promise he had made to stay, all of it had moved them into territory that was both thrilling and terrifying. As Leo chattered about his plans for the day and Sarah served pancakes shaped like animals, Robert realized he was no longer thinking about when he would leave. He was thinking about how to make his presence here sustainable, how to weave himself into the fabric of their lives in a way that would allow him to keep the promise he had made, the promise to be here for as long as they needed him. The promise that felt less like an obligation and more like the first real purpose he had found in 3 years. The morning passed with the kind of easy domesticity that Robert had never experienced, but found himself craving more of with each passing hour. After breakfast, Leo insisted on showing Robert his collection of rocks, each one carefully labeled and organized according to a system that seemed to make perfect sense to a 7-year-old. "This one is from the creek behind our house," Leo explained, holding up a smooth piece of granite. "And this one Mama found on our first day here. She said it looked like a heart, so I keep it on my nightstand." Robert examined the small, heart-shaped stone, noting how it had been worn smooth by water and time. "It is beautiful. Do you collect anything else?" "Books," Leo said proudly, leading Robert to a corner of his room where children's books were arranged with military precision. "Mama reads to me every night, but I can read some of them by myself now." As Leo showed off his reading skills, Robert found himself studying the boy's bedroom with new eyes. Every surface held evidence of Sarah's love. Hand-drawn pictures carefully framed, a mobile made from painted wooden birds, a quilt that had clearly been sewn by hand. But underneath the warmth and care, Robert could see the subtle accommodations made for a chronically ill child, the humidifier in the corner, the pulse oximeter on the nightstand, the pill organizer with its rainbow of daily medications. "Mr. Johnson," Leo said suddenly, "are you going to marry my mama?" Robert nearly choked on his coffee. "What makes you ask that?" "Because you look at her the way Prince Eric looks at Ariel in my movie," Leo said matter-of-factly. "And she looks at you the way she looks at chocolate ice cream." From the kitchen came the sound of Sarah's laughter, indicating she had overheard the conversation. Robert felt heat creep up his neck, but Leo's innocent observation had hit uncomfortably close to the truth. "Your mom and I have only known each other for a few days," Robert said carefully. "So, in my movies, people fall in love really fast all the time. Real life is more complicated than movies," Robert replied. Leo considered this with his usual seriousness. "But the feelings are the same, right? Love is love, whether it happens fast or slow." The wisdom of children, Robert thought. How had a 7-year-old managed to articulate something that grown adults spent years trying to understand? "You are very wise, Leo," Robert said finally. "Mama says I get that from my dad," Leo replied, and Robert felt his breath catch. This was the first mention Leo had made of his father, and Robert found himself intensely curious about the man who had helped create this remarkable child and then, apparently, disappeared from their lives. "Tell me about your dad," Robert said gently. Leo's expression grew thoughtful. "He was a soldier. Mama has pictures of him in his uniform. He died when I was really little, so I do not remember him much, but Mama says he would have loved me a lot." Robert felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness for Leo's loss, admiration for Sarah's strength in raising their son alone, and something that might have been relief that he was not competing with a living ex-husband for Sarah's affections. "I am sure he would have been very proud of you," Robert said softly. "Mama says he was brave, and that I got his brave heart," Leo continued. "Even though my heart is broken, she says the brave part still works." The simple statement hit Robert with devastating force. A broken but brave heart. It was perhaps the most perfect description of Leo Miller that anyone could offer. This child, facing his own mortality with grace and humor, carrying his burdens with quiet strength, loving fiercely despite every reason to protect himself from potential loss. "Your mama is right," Robert managed to say past the tightness in his throat. "You have the bravest heart I have ever known." When Sarah appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, she found Robert and Leo sitting together on the boy's bed, deep in conversation about courage and love, and the difference between the hearts that beat in chests and the hearts that lived in souls. "What are my two favorite men discussing?" Sarah asked, settling beside them. "Whether Mr. Johnson is going to marry you," Leo said with characteristic directness. "Leo!" Sarah exclaimed, her cheeks flushing bright red. "What? I was just asking," Leo said innocently. "I think he should. He makes you smile more than you have in a really long time." Robert met Sarah's eyes over Leo's head and saw a mixture of embarrassment and something deeper, a vulnerability that suggested Leo's observation had forced her to confront feelings she had been trying to keep carefully controlled. "I think," Robert said carefully, "that marriage is something grown-ups need to think about very carefully before deciding." "How long does thinking take?" Leo asked. "Different amounts of time for different people," Sarah replied, her voice slightly strained. "Well, I think you should think fast," Leo announced. "Because Mr. Johnson makes the best pancakes, and he knows all about fixing hearts, and he looks at you like you are the most beautiful mama in the whole world." Sarah's flush deepened, but Robert could see something shift in her expression, a recognition that her 7-year-old son had just articulated truths that she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. "Leo," Sarah said gently, "why do not you show Mr. Johnson your model airplanes while I start lunch?" As Leo enthusiastically began displaying his collection of plastic aircraft, Robert found his attention divided between the boy's animated explanations and Sarah's movements in the kitchen. Everything felt charged with new possibility, dangerous with implications that neither adult was quite ready to explore. But underneath the surface tension, Robert recognized something fundamental was happening. Leo had given voice to the feelings that had been growing between the adults, had forced them to confront the reality that what had started as a storm-driven encounter was becoming something much more significant. And for the first time in 3 years, Robert found himself not running from that realization, but moving toward it with something that felt like hope. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Dr. Patricia Martinez, Leo's local physician, who had driven up from the valley to check on her patient. Robert watched from the living room as the kind-faced woman in her 60s examined Leo with gentle thoroughness, noting the easy rapport between doctor and patient. "His color is not as good as I would like," Dr. Martinez murmured to Sarah, her voice low but not quite low enough to escape Robert's trained hearing. "How has his energy been?" "Declining," Sarah admitted. "He tires more easily, sleeps more during the day." Robert found himself automatically cataloguing the information, his medical mind engaging despite his best efforts to remain an uninvolved observer. Leo's deterioration was following the expected pattern for end-stage heart failure, but knowing what to expect did not make witnessing it any less devastating. "Sarah," Dr. Martinez said gently, "I think we need to discuss moving up the timeline for some of our conversations." The careful phrasing was medical code that Robert understood perfectly. They were talking about end-of-life planning, about preparing for the possibility that a suitable donor heart might not become available in time. "Not yet," Sarah said firmly. "We have the consultation with the transplant team in 3 days. I am not ready to discuss anything else until after that." Dr. Martinez nodded with understanding. "Of course. But Sarah, I want you to know that when you are ready, I am here to help you navigate whatever decisions you need to make." After the doctor left, the house felt different, heavier with unspoken realities, charged with the urgency that medical visits inevitably brought. Leo seemed unaware of the undercurrents, chattering happily about the stickers Dr. Martinez had given him. But Robert could see the weight settling on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. "She is a good doctor," Robert said quietly, as they watched Leo arrange his new stickers in a carefully organized pattern. "She has been wonderful through all of this," Sarah agreed. "When we first moved here, Leo was hospitalized 3 times in the first 6 months. Dr. Martinez made sure he got the best possible care at the local hospital, even when it meant calling in favors with specialists in Denver." "But," Robert prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice, "but she is also preparing me for the possibility that this might not end the way we hope," Sarah said softly. "She keeps talking about comfort measures and quality of life and making peace with difficult realities. That is part of her job," Robert said gently, "making sure you are prepared for all possible outcomes." "I know," Sarah replied. "I understand why she feels obligated to have those conversations, but I am not ready to hear them." "Not yet." Robert moved closer to where Sarah stood at the kitchen window, close enough to offer comfort without overwhelming her with his presence. "What would make you ready?" he asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on Leo as he played with focused concentration. "When I have exhausted every possible option," she said finally, "when I know beyond any doubt that I have done everything, tried everything, fought for every possible chance. Only then will I be ready to discuss accepting the unacceptable." The fierce determination in her voice reminded Robert why he had been drawn to medicine in the first place. The refusal to accept defeat, the willingness to fight impossible odds, the belief that miracles were just medicine we had not yet learned to perform reliably. "What does the transplant team need to see in order to move Leo higher on the list?" Robert asked. Sarah pulled out a folder, different from the medical records she had shown him before, and spread several documents across the kitchen table. Social worker evaluations, psychological assessments, proof of insurance coverage, evidence of family support systems, she said, pointing to each category. "They need to be convinced that Leo will have the best possible chance of survival and long-term success." Robert studied the paperwork with the analytical eye he had once brought to surgical planning. Everything appeared to be in order, but he knew the subtle factors that could influence transplant committee decisions, factors that often had more to do with perception than medical reality. "Have you considered relocating temporarily to be closer to the transplant center?" Robert asked. "I looked into it," Sarah replied, "but the costs are prohibitive. Temporary housing near the hospital, reduced income from not being able to work, Leo's need for stability during an already stressful time. It felt like it would create more problems than it solved." Robert nodded, understanding the impossible calculations that parents of seriously ill children were forced to make. Every decision carried medical, financial, and emotional consequences that could not be adequately weighed against each other. "What if those factors were not obstacles?" Robert asked quietly. Sarah looked up from the paperwork, her expression questioning. "What if you had access to housing near the transplant center, financial resources to cover all expenses, and a support system that could provide stability for Leo during the process?" "Robert," Sarah began, recognizing the direction of his thoughts. "I am not talking about charity," Robert said firmly. "I am talking about partnership, about using every available resource to give Leo the best possible chance." "I cannot accept that kind of help from you," Sarah said. But Robert could hear the longing in her voice, the desperate wish that she could accept, that pride was not one more obstacle between her son and the care he needed. "Why not?" "Because it would change everything between us," Sarah said honestly. "Because I would never know if your feelings for me were real or if they were tangled up with obligation and pity and your need to save someone after failing to save that little girl." The words hit Robert like a physical blow, partly because they touched on fears he had not fully acknowledged even to himself. Was his growing attachment to Sarah and Leo driven by genuine affection, or by his desperate need for redemption? Did it matter if the outcome was Leo getting the care he needed? "You think I am here because I am trying to atone for Emma Castellano's death?" Robert asked. "I think you are here because you have a good heart and you cannot stand to see suffering when you have the power to alleviate it," Sarah replied. "But I also think you are carrying guilt that has nothing to do with me or Leo, and I will not be the person you use to absolve yourself of that guilt." The honesty of her response left Robert momentarily speechless. Sarah had seen through to the heart of his motivations with the clarity that seemed to characterize everything about her. "You are right," Robert said finally. "I am carrying guilt, and yes, part of me sees helping Leo as a chance to make amends for my failures. But that does not mean my feelings for you are not real." "How can you be sure?" Sarah asked. "How can either of us be sure what is real when everything is tangled up with medical crises and desperate circumstances, and the kind of intensity that makes people think they feel things they might not actually feel?" It was a fair question, and Robert found himself without a ready answer. How could he separate his growing love for Sarah from his desire to save her son? How could he prove that his commitment to them was about more than professional redemption? From the living room came the sound of Leo's laughter as he discovered a new way to arrange his airplane collection, and Robert felt something settle in his chest with absolute certainty. "Because," Robert said quietly, "even if Leo was perfectly healthy, even if you needed nothing from me that my medical knowledge or financial resources could provide, I would still want to be here. I would still want to wake up in your house and drink coffee in your kitchen and listen to your son's stories about bears that can fly." Sarah studied his face as if searching for evidence of deception or self-delusion. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because some of the tension left her shoulders. "That is a beautiful thing to say," she said softly. "It is a true thing to say," Robert replied. "The truest thing I have said in 3 years." The morning of the transplant consultation dawned grey and overcast, matching the tension that had been building in the small house for the past 3 days. Robert woke to find Sarah already dressed and moving through her morning routine with the mechanical precision of someone trying to control what could be controlled while facing the uncontrollable. Leo was unusually quiet during breakfast, picking at his food with none of his typical enthusiasm. The boy seemed to sense the importance of the day, even though Sarah had been careful to frame the hospital visit as just another checkup with some new doctors. "Will there be lots of machines?" Leo asked, as Sarah helped him into his jacket. "Probably some," Sarah replied honestly, "but nothing that will hurt. The doctors just want to listen to your heart and ask us some questions." Robert loaded their bags into his sedan, noting how Sarah had packed with the thoroughness of someone who understood that hospital visits could extend far beyond their scheduled duration. Extra clothes for Leo, snacks, medications, entertainment, everything a mother might need to keep her child comfortable during a potentially long day. The drive to Denver took 2 hours, winding down from the mountains through increasingly urban landscape. Robert found himself stealing glances at Sarah, who sat in the passenger seat with Leo's medical files clutched in her lap like a talisman. "Tell me about the transplant team," Robert said, partly to break the silence, and partly because he genuinely wanted to understand what they would be facing. "Dr. William Harrison is the lead cardiac surgeon," Sarah replied, consulting her notes. "He has been doing pediatric heart transplants for 15 years. Dr. Jennifer Chen handles the pre-transplant evaluation process. There will also be a social worker, a nutritionist, and a transplant coordinator." Robert nodded, recognizing the standard composition of a pediatric transplant team. Good programs were comprehensive, addressing not just the medical aspects of transplantation, but the psychological, social, and practical challenges that families faced. What questions are you most worried about them asking? Robert asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of months of anxiety. Whether I can provide adequate support during Leo's recovery, whether I have realistic expectations about outcomes, whether I am prepared for the possibility that even with a transplant, Leo might not... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah, Robert said gently, you are the most devoted mother I have ever encountered. No transplant team could question your commitment to Leo's well-being. But I am doing this alone, Sarah replied. Single mothers have to work twice as hard to prove they can provide the kind of stable, supportive environment that transplant committees want to see. You are not doing this alone anymore, Robert said, the words carrying more weight than he had intended. Sarah turned to look at him, and Robert saw hope and fear warring in her expression. They had not discussed what his presence at the consultation meant, had not defined the role he would play, or the level of involvement he was prepared to commit to long-term. Robert, Sarah began, but Leo's voice from the back seat interrupted. Are we almost there? I can see really tall buildings. Almost there, sweetheart, Sarah replied, her attention shifting back to her son. But Robert caught her eye in the rearview mirror and saw the question that remained unspoken. What exactly are you promising when you say I am not doing this alone? It was a fair question, and one Robert realized he needed to answer for himself as much as for Sarah. What was he promising? Financial support? Emotional presence, a future together that extended beyond Leo's medical crisis. The Denver Children's Hospital rose before them like a monument to both hope and heartbreak, a gleaming facility where miracles were performed daily and where families also received the worst news of their lives. Robert felt familiar anxiety tighten his chest as they pulled into the parking garage. It is going to be all right, Robert said, though he was not sure if he was reassuring Sarah, Leo, or himself. I know, Sarah replied, but her voice carried the forced confidence of someone trying to believe her own words. As they walked through the hospital corridors toward the transplant clinic, Robert found himself automatically cataloging details with the trained eye of someone who had spent 15 years in similar facilities. The quality of the equipment, the efficiency of the staff, the general atmosphere of controlled urgency that characterized good pediatric programs. This is an excellent facility, Robert murmured to Sarah as they waited to be called back for Leo's appointment. How can you tell? The staff-to-patient ratios, the organization of the clinical areas, the way the nurses interact with families, Robert explained. These are indicators of a program that prioritizes both medical excellence and family-centered care. Sarah nodded, taking comfort in his professional assessment. Around them, other families waited with the particular tension that accompanied major medical consultations, children clutching stuffed animals, parents reviewing insurance paperwork, siblings trying to understand why their brother or sister required such serious medical attention. Miller family, a nurse appeared in the doorway with a warm smile. Dr. Chen is ready to see you. As they followed the nurse down the corridor, Leo slipped his hand into Robert's with the casual trust that children reserved for adults they felt safe with. The simple gesture hit Robert with unexpected force, reminding him how much was at stake in the conversations they were about to have. Dr. Chen turned out to be a woman in her early 40s, with kind eyes and an immediately reassuring presence. She spent the first 20 minutes of the appointment simply talking with Leo, engaging him in conversation about school and hobbies and favorite movies, while subtly assessing his cognitive function and emotional state. Leo is a remarkable young man, Dr. Chen said to Sarah after completing her initial evaluation. His maturity and positive attitude are significant factors in his favor for transplant candidacy. What other factors do you consider? Sarah asked, her notebook ready to capture every detail. Medical factors, obviously, the severity of his condition, his overall health status, his likelihood of surviving the surgery and thriving afterward. But we also look at psychosocial factors, family support systems, compliance with medical regimens, realistic expectations about outcomes. Robert listened as Dr. Chen outlined the evaluation process, impressed by her thoroughness and sensitivity. When she began asking about Sarah's support network, Robert found himself leaning forward, ready to speak. "I should mention," Robert said carefully, "that I am here as both a family friend and as someone with medical expertise who can help Sarah navigate the process." Dr. Chen's eyebrows raised slightly. "Are you a physician?" "Former pediatric cardiac surgeon," Robert replied. "Currently in medical technology development, but I have experience with cases similar to Leo's." Something shifted in Dr. Chen's expression, not quite surprise, but a recognition that the consultation had just taken on additional complexity. "I see," she said thoughtfully. "And your relationship to the family." Robert felt Sarah's eyes on him, waiting to see how he would define their connection. The question was more loaded than it appeared, carrying implications for how the transplant team would view Leo's support system. "I am someone who cares deeply about both Sarah and Leo," Robert said finally. "Someone who is committed to ensuring Leo receives the best possible care." Dr. Chen made notes in her file, and Robert could practically see her adjusting her assessment based on this new information. A former cardiac surgeon in the family support network would be viewed very favorably by any transplant committee. "Well," Dr. Chen said, "let us continue with the medical evaluation, and then we will discuss next steps." As the appointment progressed through blood draws, imaging studies, and consultations with various team members, Robert found himself slipping back into familiar patterns of medical observation and analysis. He watched Leo handle each procedure with remarkable courage, saw Sarah advocate fiercely for her son while maintaining her composure, observed the transplant team functioning with the kind of coordinated efficiency that characterized excellent medical programs. But underneath his professional assessment, Robert was acutely aware that they were not just evaluating Leo's candidacy for transplantation. They were determining whether this remarkable child would live or die, whether Sarah would keep her son or lose him, whether Robert would have the chance to be part of a future that included both of them. When Dr. Harrison, the lead surgeon, finally met with them late in the afternoon, his assessment was both encouraging and sobering. "Leo is an excellent candidate for heart transplantation," he said without preamble. "His overall health status is good, his family support appears strong, and his psychological resilience is remarkable. We will be recommending him for active listing on the transplant waiting list." Sarah's relief was so profound she seemed to sag in her chair. "How long is the typical wait?" "For a child Leo's size and blood type, anywhere from 3 to 18 months, Dr. Harrison replied. "But I need to be honest with you about Leo's current status. His cardiac function has declined significantly since his last evaluation. We will be listing him as status 1, which means he has the highest priority for available organs." "What does that mean practically?" Robert asked, his medical training automatically translating the implications. "It means Leo's condition is critical enough that he needs a transplant within the next few months to survive," Dr. Harrison said gently. "It also means that when an appropriate heart becomes available, we will move very quickly." Sarah absorbed this information with the composure she had developed over months of receiving difficult medical news, but Robert could see the fear beneath her calm exterior. "What do we need to do to prepare?" Sarah asked. "Leo will need to remain within 2 hours of the hospital," Dr. Harrison explained. "When we call, you will have approximately 4 hours to get here before the surgery begins. I also recommend that you establish temporary housing in the Denver area, at least until after the transplant and initial recovery period. Robert felt Sarah tense beside him, knowing that the practical requirements Dr. Harrison was outlining represented challenges that went far beyond the medical aspects of Leo's care. "We will work that out," Robert said firmly, meeting Sarah's surprised glance with steady reassurance. As they left the hospital that evening, Leo chattering excitedly about the cool machines he had seen, and Sarah clutching a folder full of post-consultation instructions, Robert realized that the day had changed everything. Leo was now officially on the heart transplant waiting list, which meant they were no longer hoping for a miracle. They were waiting for one and preparing to act when it arrived. The drive back to the mountains was subdued, with Leo sleeping in the back seat and Sarah staring out the passenger window at the darkening landscape. The weight of the day's revelations seemed to fill the car: Leo's critical status, the need to relocate temporarily to Denver, the reality that they were now in a race against time. "Status 1, Sarah said quietly, the first words either of them had spoken since leaving the hospital parking garage. "It means they are taking his case very seriously," Robert replied. "It means he will get priority when a heart becomes available. It also means his condition is worse than I wanted to admit," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert glanced at her profile in the dashboard light, seeing the careful control she was maintaining while Leo slept nearby. They had both understood the subtext of Dr. Harrison's evaluation. Leo's window for transplantation was narrowing rapidly. "Sarah," Robert began, then stopped, unsure how to offer comfort for something so fundamentally devastating. "I knew," Sarah said suddenly. "I knew his condition was deteriorating, knew the timeline was accelerating, but hearing it stated so clinically, so definitively, it makes it real in a way that is hard to accept." They drove in silence for several miles before Robert spoke again. "The housing situation in Denver. I cannot afford extended stay housing near the hospital," Sarah interrupted. "I have looked into it. Even the most basic accommodations would exhaust my savings within a month." "Then you will stay with me," Robert said, the decision forming as he spoke the words. "Robert, I have a corporate apartment in Denver that sits empty most of the year," Robert continued. 2 bedrooms, fully furnished, 15 minutes from the hospital. "You and Leo can stay there for as long as necessary." Sarah was quiet for so long that Robert began to worry he had overstepped, pushed too hard, made offers that felt more like obligations than gestures of support. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked finally. It was the same question she had asked before, but now it carried additional weight. Now they were talking about months of shared living space, about Robert restructuring his life around their needs, about commitments that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. "Because I love you," Robert said simply, the words emerging before he could stop them or second-guess their timing. The admission hung in the air between them, like something fragile and precious and terrifying. Robert had not planned to declare his feelings during a medical crisis, had not intended to complicate an already overwhelming day with emotional revelations that demanded their own processing. But the words had been building inside him for days, and Dr. Harrison's assessment had crystallized something Robert could no longer deny. He was not just helping strangers navigate a medical emergency. He was fighting for the future of the woman he loved and the child who had already claimed a piece of his heart. "Robert," Sarah whispered, and he could hear tears in her voice. "I know the timing is terrible," Robert said quickly. "I know you have enough to worry about without adding complicated feelings to the mix. But Sarah, I needed you to know that my offer to help is not about guilt or obligation or my need for professional redemption. It is about love. It is about wanting to be part of your life, part of Leo's life, regardless of what happens medically." Sarah was crying now, silent tears that reflected the dashboard lights as they wound through mountain curves. Robert wanted to pull over, to hold her, to take back the words if they were causing more pain than comfort. "I love you too," Sarah said quietly, the admission seeming to surprise her as much as it did Robert. "I have been trying not to love you, trying to keep some emotional distance in case you decided this was all too complicated, too difficult. But I love you, and that terrifies me almost as much as losing Leo." Robert felt his chest tighten with a mixture of relief and overwhelming tenderness. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because loving you means wanting a future together, and I cannot think about the future until I know Leo is going to be part of it," Sarah replied. "Because loving you means trusting you with everything that matters to me, and I have been taking care of everything myself for so long that trust feels dangerous." "Trust is dangerous," Robert agreed, "but so is going through this alone when you do not have to." They had reached Sarah's driveway, the small house appearing through the pine trees like a beacon of warmth and safety. Robert turned off the engine, and they sat in the sudden silence, both processing the magnitude of what they had just admitted to each other. "Leo is going to wake up and wonder why we are sitting in the car," Sarah said finally, a note of humor creeping into her voice, despite the tears. "Leo is going to ask when we are getting married," Robert replied, remembering the boys' earlier observations about their obvious attraction. "What will you tell him?" Robert turned to face Sarah fully, taking in her tear-stained face, her rumpled clothes from the long day at the hospital, her expression of vulnerability and hope and bone-deep exhaustion. "I will tell him that grown-ups need time to figure out complicated things," Robert said carefully, "but I will also tell him that I am not going anywhere, that I love his mother and I love him, and that I plan to be here for whatever comes next." Sarah reached across the console and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that felt both familiar and momentous. "What if what comes next is terrible?" she asked quietly. "What if the transplant does not work? Or if they cannot find a donor in time, or if I lose him despite everything we are doing?" "Then we will face it together," Robert said firmly. "And if the worst happens, I will still be here to help you through it. And if the best happens, I will still be here to celebrate with you." "That is a big promise to make." "It is the only promise that matters," Robert replied. From the back seat came the sound of Leo stirring, his small voice sleepy and confused. "Are we home? Why are we not moving?" "We are home, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice steadier now. "We were just talking about the day. Did the doctors say I can get a new heart?" Leo asked with the directness that characterized all his important questions. Sarah looked at Robert, and he saw her drawing strength from his presence, his support, his promise to face whatever came next together. "They said you are at the top of the list," Sarah told her son. "They said when the right heart becomes available, you will be ready." "Good," Leo said with satisfaction. "I am ready for a heart that works right, and I am ready for Mr. Johnson to be my new dad." The innocent declaration hit both adults with the force of recognition. Leo had been thinking about their future too, had been hoping for the kind of family stability that his young life had largely lacked. "Leo," Sarah began, but Robert squeezed her hand gently. "One thing at a time," Robert said softly, speaking to both Sarah and Leo. "First, we get you a healthy heart. Then we figure out everything else." "But you will stay until then?" Leo asked, and Robert heard the uncertainty that the boy had been hiding beneath his usual optimism. "I will stay," Robert promised, meeting Leo's eyes in the rearview mirror. "For as long as you and your mother want me here, I will stay." As they gathered their things from the hospital visit and made their way into the small house that had become Robert's unexpected sanctuary, he realized that his answer to Leo had been more than a comfort to a worried child. It had been a vow to the woman he loved and the boy who had taught him what family could look like when built on love rather than obligation. It had been a commitment to a future that would be shaped by whatever medical challenges lay ahead, but would be grounded in the certainty that they would face those challenges together. The call came 3 weeks later, at 4:37 in the morning. Robert woke to the sound of Sarah's phone ringing in the Denver apartment where they had been staying since the consultation. He was instantly alert, his medical training having conditioned him to recognize the particular urgency of middle-of-the-night calls. "This is Sarah Miller," he heard her say, her voice carefully controlled despite having been pulled from deep sleep. Robert sat up in bed, listening to the one-sided conversation that would determine everything about their immediate future. "Yes, we can be there in 20 minutes, Sarah said. "Thank you." "Yes, I understand." She hung up and turned to Robert, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the apartment windows. "They have a heart," she whispered. "They have a heart for Leo." For a moment, neither of them moved, the magnitude of the moment rendering them temporarily paralyzed. After months of waiting, hoping, preparing for this call, the reality of it felt both surreal and terrifyingly urgent. "We need to wake Leo," Robert said, swinging his legs out of bed and reaching for his clothes. "Robert," Sarah said, catching his arm as he stood. "What if—" "No," Robert said firmly, understanding the fear that was trying to surface in her voice. "No what-ifs. This is Leo's heart. This is his chance. Everything else is just details we will handle as they come." Sarah nodded, drawing strength from his certainty, and moved toward Leo's room to wake their son for the most important day of his young life. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and urgent conversations about surgical timing and post-operative care. Leo, still sleepy but growing more excited as he understood what was happening, chattered nervously about whether his new heart would like the same foods his old heart liked. "Will I still be me after the surgery?" Leo asked as they pulled into the hospital parking garage. "You will be exactly the same, Leo," Sarah assured him, her voice steady despite the tears Robert could see gathering in her eyes. "Just with a heart that works perfectly, and you will both be here when I wake up." "We will both be here," Robert promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. The next several hours unfolded with the controlled urgency that characterized major transplant procedures. Leo was prepped for surgery with remarkable calm, charming the nursing staff with his questions about the operating room and his excitement about meeting his new heart. "Take good care of him," Sarah whispered to the anesthesiologist as Leo drifted off to sleep. "We will," came the professional reassurance, but Robert knew that no amount of medical expertise could guarantee the outcome they all desperately wanted. As Leo was wheeled into the operating room, Sarah collapsed into Robert's arms with the force of someone who had been holding herself together through sheer will and could finally allow herself to break down. "I cannot lose him," she sobbed into Robert's chest. "I cannot lose him, Robert. I cannot survive losing him." "You are not going to lose him," Robert said fiercely, holding her as tightly as he dared. "Leo is strong, the surgical team is excellent, and this is his heart. This is his miracle." They settled into the surgical waiting room with the grim patience that families learn during long medical procedures. Robert found himself automatically tracking time, calculating surgical milestones, interpreting the subtle cues that indicated how the procedure was progressing. "How long should it take?" Sarah asked, though Robert knew she already understood the timeline from their pre-surgical consultations. 6 to 8 hours for the complete procedure, Robert replied. "They will send updates periodically, but the most important update will come when Dr. Harrison tells us the surgery is complete." 4 hours into the wait, Dr. Harrison appeared in the waiting room doorway, still wearing surgical scrubs. Robert felt his heart stop, knowing that surgeons only left the operating room during procedures if something had gone seriously wrong. "The surgery is going very well," Dr. Harrison said immediately, clearly recognizing the panic in Sarah's face. "Leo is doing beautifully. The new heart is functioning perfectly, and we are beginning the final stages of the procedure." Sarah's relief was so profound, she nearly collapsed. "He is going to be all right." "Barring any unexpected complications, yes," Dr. Harrison said with the careful optimism that cardiac surgeons learn to employ. "I expect to have him in recovery within the next 2 hours." After Dr. Harrison returned to the operating room, Sarah turned to Robert with an expression of overwhelming gratitude and love. "This is really happening," she whispered. "Leo is going to have a healthy heart." "This is really happening," Robert agreed, feeling his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. But as they waited for the final update, as they prepared to see Leo with his new heart, Robert found himself thinking about another operating room, another child, another family who had waited with the same desperate hope. Emma Castellano had been 9 years old, with the same diagnosis as Leo, the same desperate need for a miracle. Her parents had trusted Robert with everything that mattered to them, and he had failed them in the most devastating way possible. "Robert," Sarah's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "What is wrong? You look terrified." Robert realized his hands were shaking, his breathing shallow. The proximity to pediatric cardiac surgery, the weight of Leo's life hanging in the balance, the terrible familiarity of waiting for news that could change everything, it was all bringing back memories he had spent 3 years trying to suppress. "I need to tell you something," Robert said quietly. "About Emma Castellano, about what really happened in that operating room." Sarah took his hands in hers, steadying them with her touch. "Tell me." "She had the same condition as Leo, the same timeline, the same desperate need for transplantation," Robert began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But her case was more complex, her anatomy more challenging. I thought I could handle it. I thought my experience and skill were enough to overcome the technical difficulties. What went wrong? I made a judgment call during the procedure," Robert continued, the words tasting like ashes. "I attempted a repair technique that I had used successfully before, but Emma's heart was too damaged, too fragile. The tissue tore, and she went into cardiac arrest. We lost her on the table." Sarah absorbed this confession with the same steady strength she brought to everything in her life. "It was a surgical complication. It was not your fault." "I should have known the risks were too high," Robert said. "I should have chosen a more conservative approach, should have recognized that my desire to save her was clouding my surgical judgment." "Robert," Sarah said firmly, "you were trying to save a child's life. You made the best decision you could with the information you had. That is what doctors do. But what if I had made the wrong decision? What if my need to prove I could save everyone led me to take unnecessary risks?" "Then you learned from it," Sarah replied. "And now you will use that knowledge to help other children, other families." Robert looked at this remarkable woman who was offering him forgiveness for failures she had not even witnessed, and felt something shift inside his chest. The guilt that had driven him from medicine, the self-doubt that had kept him in isolation for 3 years, the fear that he was not worthy of trust, all of it seemed suddenly less important than the simple truth that sometimes healing meant accepting imperfection, embracing the possibility of failure while still choosing to care. "I love you," Robert said quietly. "I love you for seeing something in me that I could not see in myself. I love you for being brave enough to care again," Sarah replied, "for being here, for helping us, for choosing to trust that this time will be different." 2 hours later, Dr. Harrison returned to deliver the news they had been waiting months to hear. "The surgery was a complete success," he announced with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Leo's new heart is functioning beautifully. He is awake, asking for his mother and wanting to know if he can have ice cream." Sarah's tears of relief were matched by Robert's own emotional response. Not just joy for Leo's successful surgery, but gratitude for the chance to witness a miracle rather than a tragedy, to be part of healing rather than loss. As they followed Dr. Harrison toward the recovery room where Leo was waiting, Robert realized that his 3-year exile from medicine was finally over. Not because he had found the courage to operate again, but because he had found the courage to love again, to invest in outcomes he could not control, to trust in possibilities he could not guarantee, to believe that sometimes the greatest healing happened not in operating rooms, but in the simple act of choosing to care about someone else's well-being more than your own safety. Leo was going to live, and Robert was going to be there to help him grow up. 6 months later, Robert stood in Sarah's backyard, watching Leo chase a butterfly through the wildflowers that had bloomed with the arrival of spring. The boy's color was perfect now, rosy cheeks, bright eyes, energy that seemed boundless after months of careful cardiac function. "He is like a different child," Sarah said, joining Robert on the back porch with 2 cups of coffee. "He is the same child," Robert corrected gently, "just with the health he was always meant to have." They watched Leo discover a particularly interesting rock, his excitement over geological treasures undimmed by his medical journey. The boy had recovered from transplant surgery with remarkable resilience, embracing his new heart with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else in his life. "I got a call from Dr. Chen yesterday," Sarah said. "Leo's latest biopsy results were perfect. No signs of rejection, excellent cardiac function." "That is wonderful news," Robert replied, though he had already seen the results through his contacts at the hospital. Old habits from his medical career died hard, but now instead of analyzing test results with clinical detachment, he found himself celebrating each positive outcome as a victory for the family he loved. She also asked if I had given any thought to her suggestion about nursing school, Sarah continued. Robert turned to look at her, recognizing the careful way she had introduced the topic. They had talked about Sarah's desire to return to healthcare, but the conversation had remained theoretical until Leo's health stabilized enough to make long-term planning possible. "What did you tell her?" "That I am interested, but that I need to make sure Leo's care would not suffer," Sarah replied. "Dr. Chen reminded me that the University of Colorado has an excellent nursing program with flexible scheduling for working parents." "And what do you think?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching Leo attempt to construct an elaborate fort from fallen branches and spring flowers. "I think I want to specialize in pediatric cardiac nursing," she said finally. "I want to help other families navigate what we went through. I want to be the kind of nurse who understands what parents are feeling when their child needs heart surgery." Robert felt his chest tighten with pride and love. Of course, Sarah would want to transform her experience into a way to help others. It was exactly the kind of purposeful healing that characterized everything about her. "That would be extraordinary," Robert said softly. "You would be extraordinary at that. It would mean 2 years of school, clinical rotations, studying while Leo is sleeping," Sarah continued, "and it would mean depending on you more than I am comfortable depending on anyone." "Sarah," Robert said, setting down his coffee and taking her hands in his, "you are not depending on me. We are building a life together. We are sharing responsibilities and supporting each other's dreams and creating the kind of partnership that makes both of us stronger." 6 months of living together had taught them both the rhythms of shared domestic life. Robert had discovered that he loved the controlled chaos of family mornings, the gentle negotiations over dinner choices, The way Leo's bedtime stories had evolved to include adventures featuring both parents and elaborate plot lines involving cars and medical equipment. Sarah had learned to accept help without feeling diminished by it, to trust that Robert's commitment to their family was not contingent on crisis or medical emergency, to believe that love could be both partnership and passion. "There is something else," Sarah said, and Robert heard nervousness in her voice that made him focus completely on her words. "What is it?" "Leo asked me yesterday when you're going to officially become his dad," Sarah said. "He said he has been waiting very patiently, but that he would like to know if there is a timeline he should be aware of." Robert laughed, charmed by Leo's characteristic directness. "What did you tell him?" "That grown-ups move slower than 7-year-olds when it comes to making important decisions," Sarah replied. "But Robert, he is not wrong to wonder. We have been living as a family for months now. We love each other. We are planning a future together. We are committed to each other through whatever challenges come next." "Are you asking me to marry you, Sarah Miller?" Robert asked, his heart racing with anticipation. "I am asking you what you want," Sarah replied. "I'm asking you if you are ready to make our family official." Robert looked at this remarkable woman who had saved his life as surely as he had helped save her son's life, who had taught him that healing was not just about fixing what was broken, but about building something beautiful from the pieces that remained. "I want to marry you," Robert said, the words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I want to adopt Leo officially. I want to build a life with both of you that honors what we have been through and celebrates what we have found together." Sarah's smile was radiant enough to power the small mountain town where they had found each other during a storm that had changed everything. "Then we should probably tell Leo," she said, "before he stages an intervention." They called Leo over from his fort-building project, and the boy approached with the serious expression he reserved for important family discussions. "Are you finally going to get married?" Leo asked without preamble. "We are thinking about it," Robert replied solemnly. "What do you think about that idea?" "I think it is about time," Leo said with satisfaction. "And I think we should have a party with really good cake." "What else should we have at this party?" Sarah asked, clearly enjoying Leo's wedding planning enthusiasm. "Dancing," Leo said immediately, "and flowers everywhere." "And you should wear a really pretty dress, Mama. And Robert should wear a fancy suit, and I should get to be the ring bearer because I am practically an expert at carrying important things." As Leo continued outlining his vision for their wedding celebration, Robert felt something settle in his chest with perfect clarity. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it. Not redemption for past failures, not absolution for professional mistakes, but simply the chance to love completely and be loved in return. A year ago, he had been a man running from the ghosts of his past, convinced that isolation was the price of avoiding further heartbreak. Now he was part of a family that had taught him the difference between existing and living, between surviving and thriving. Leo's new heart had saved the boy's life, but Sarah's love had saved Robert's soul. As they sat together on the back porch, planning a wedding and a future and all the ordinary miracles that make up a shared life, Robert realized that the storm that had brought him to Sarah's door had been exactly the kind of weather he needed. Devastating enough to strip away everything he thought he knew about himself, powerful enough to wash him up on the shores of a love he never could have imagined. "Robert," Leo said suddenly, interrupting his own elaborate wedding planning monologue, "will you still be my heart doctor even after you are my dad?" The question hit Robert with unexpected emotion, carrying as it did Leo's innocent understanding that some roles transcended titles, that caring for someone's well-being was a responsibility that existed independent of official relationships. "Always," Robert promised, the word encompassing everything he could not say about love and commitment, and the kind of healing that happened when broken people chose to trust each other with their most precious vulnerabilities. "Good," Leo said with satisfaction. "Because my heart works really well now. But it is always going to be special, and special hearts need special doctors." Robert looked at Sarah and saw his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. Wonder at the wisdom of children, gratitude for second chances, amazement at the way love could transform the most devastating experiences into the foundation for something beautiful. Leo's heart was indeed special, and not just because it had been transplanted. It was special because it beat with the rhythm of a child who had faced mortality and chosen hope, who had accepted love from a stranger and helped that stranger remember what family could mean. As the afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold, as Leo returned to his elaborate fort construction and Sarah began planning their evening meal, Robert felt the last of his 3-year exile finally ending. He was home. Not just in Sarah's house, not just in this mountain town, but in the life they were building together, one ordinary miracle at a time. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.